to imagine that, I'll use your shorthand, the web of life has their own intelligence. How would you characterize that intelligence? Because it's quite impossible for our three-dimensional mind to conceptualize it with our language that we've been given. But I also have to imagine that within different dimensions of reality, there are different challenges in terms of conceptualizing of these different aspects. This is an impossible question, as many of these are, but using our limited language, how would you characterize that next, maybe not next, but that dimension of an intelligence? Do you think it feels similar to a consciousness or something else?
That's a really interesting question. We would have to define consciousness to answer that question. And that's a very hard thing to do. So the things that are coming up, or were coming up as you spoke, are there's a woman called Tanya Luhrmann who speaks of citadel mind. She was an anthropologist. She did her first published study, which I think was her PhD and then became a book, where she joined a group of pagan practitioners in the UK and studied them as if she were an anthropologist. And I think she was expecting to come away and go, well, they just do all this weird stuff and it's completely pointless. And she came out of it going, no, this is real. And Michael Harner, who kind of codified some contemporary shamanic work and turned it into a system that was then trademarked and whatever. Somebody asked him at the end of his life, what would you like to say? And he said, spirits are real. And yet a lot of people that I've met who follow his system are convinced that what we're doing is tapping deep levels of our own unconscious when we're doing shamanic work and bringing them to the surface. That's probably a conversation for later or a different time. However, what Tanya Luhrmann pointed out and what Harner is saying is spirits are real. That what we call the trauma culture, what Francis Weller has defined as trauma culture as opposed to initiation culture, our culture that was brought to the islands of Britain 2,000 years ago by Rome. Rome didn't invent it. It's been, whatever it was that created the schism between a small group of humanity and the rest of the rest of the web of life, is not common to the rest of humanity. And so if we were to be having this conversation in any indigenous culture, that question would have no meaning because you would simply be part of the web of life and you would know it. Vanessa Andreotti is a really fascinating woman. She wrote Hospicing Modernity, and she's Brazilian. She's half German and half indigenous. And she's the dean of a university in Canada. I can't remember which one. And she runs the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures program. And her indigenous grandfather said that the core trauma of colonization was not so much the taking of land and the killing of people, which are both appalling and awful and deeply traumatizing, but the core, they were epiphenomena of an original trauma, which was the belief in separability. And it's not even the belief in separation. It's the belief that separation can happen.
Right.
That separability is a thing. And all indigenous people know that it's not.
Right.
And they just know it in their marrow. They've known it from before they could walk. So we're struggling, I think, in our culture to find the language. And one of the other things Vanessa says is that our language is 70-80% nouns, their language is 70-80% verbs. And it's really hard in a noun-based language to be connected. It's very hard to be. And once we've abandoned foraging and hunting and being within the web of life as an integral part of what we're doing, we create lifestyles that are predicated on separation, scarcity, and powerlessness, where we have to have a job instead of being. And in all of the indigenous cultures, the work of being is a tiny fraction of every day, and the rest of the day is being in community.
Right.
And we turn that so far upside down that sometimes there is no community. So answering that question is more, for me, how do we bridge that gap? We can't wait until we all learn to speak 80% verbs. We haven't got time for that. We have to, within our culture, within our noun-based, trauma-separated culture, work out how to reconnect. It's our birthright. We've had 300,000 years of human evolution and a tiny, tiny sliver at the end of that where we cut ourselves off. But even so, if it was 2,000 years ago in the islands of Britain, that's still 100 generations of trauma. Generation after generation after generation. And so my question that arises from your question is, how can we be connected to ourselves enough that we can then connect to the web of life so that we can ask it and feel it? And in the moments when I am connected, and it's not all day, every day by any means, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and it doesn't always pan out the way I think it's going to. There's
Mm-hmm.
just a sense of being part of something so much bigger and so
Mm-hmm.
much more sentient that our concept of what sentience is doesn't map on. It's like somebody asked
Right.
ChatGPT, what's the difference between the intelligence of a human and your intelligence? And it said the difference between an amoeba and a person. And it's the person and we're the amoeba. And it might not be right. ChatGPT hallucinates a lot, but that's what it said at the time. And I would say that being part of the web of life sometimes feels like that, but it's more probably like being a piece of plankton in the sea, because the
Mm.
plankton is an integral part of everything that's going on in the life of the ocean, or even being a wave in the sea. The wave is an integral part of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And the visions that I had that kicked off this phase of what I'm doing, the accidental gods phase, straight after Schumacher, were of the globe of the earth, that blue pearl floating through the blackness of space that we saw when people first walked on the moon, surrounded by uncounted millions of very fine threads of light all over the globe. And they were crossing and crossing and crossing and crossing. And every crossing point was a node of consciousness, and some of them were human and most of them were not. And in the world I live in, the tree and the red kite and the river and the hill and the computer that we're talking through and the internet are all entities, agencies of potential consciousness.
Mm.
And some are more obviously conscious and some are less. And I don't spend a huge amount of time wrapping my head around how do I parse that out. I have a baseline. Does it change what I'm going to do? Does it change how I feel?
Mm.
And if the answer to both of those is no, then I don't need to wrap my head around it. That becomes pointless philosophy. And I've listened to a lot of philosophers and thought, really, honestly? And has that changed the world at all? No.
Right. Right.
So that's my
How?
baseline criterion.
Yeah. No, I think that's really brilliant. And as someone who also formally studied philosophy, it is quite remarkable how you can leave a philosophy class and then say, well, I don't really have to think about that, do I? Or it can be absolutely life alteringly
Right,
important
right.
to answer that question.
Okay.
And what do we spend our time focusing on? I also think I want to go back to one of your earlier points about the inherent trauma of settler colonialism, colonialism in general, being the belief in separation, because something that came up for me in that was how generational trauma is so embedded in our nervous system, in our genetics, and of course, the traumas that have been enacted upon others, on Indigenous people that are horrific. Carrying the trauma of also being a colonizer is something that I have been really interestingly grappling with as I have these conversations. And I think it's interesting to think about how dehumanization to anyone, by anyone, anywhere is a threat to humanity everywhere,
Yep.
including ourselves. The same way, in a smaller, I guess, example of this, one of the newer thoughts around feminism and the patriarchy is that the patriarchy is extremely damaging for men too.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? Colonialism is extremely damaging for colonizers as well. Not to make this about the oppressors by any means, but I think that that is such a fascinating point that really shows the way in which, even sitting here having this conversation with you, to wrap my mind around the idea that it is not even trying to connect with something, it is forgetting the fact that we are not, that we are disconnected, and
Yeah.
returning to this remembrance
Yeah.
of connection.
Yes.
I'm very fascinated with how your interest in these concepts arose. I find that a lot of people that I have conversations like this with are like, I just always had this like innate drive or
Yeah.
calling towards something bigger than myself. And even I think we can see that in your veterinary work, right? It is this healing, very deeply aligned with nature practice. Where do you conceive of the inception of something like this? And why do you think you are called to this work? I think we are all called to it in different ways, but
there's different people call differently. So there are two pathways into that, and one of them is if it is right that we choose the life that we lead as a point between incarnations, then clearly this life was designed to be this. Because I can't remember a time when it wasn't what I was trying to do. I just didn't have the language or the tools when I was a kid. And finding those little by little, oh, there are other people who think like this, or finding books like The Last of the Mohicans. When I was a kid, the BBC did a black and white version, which was considerably better than any other version ever. I'm not a great fan of the BBC, but they did that particularly really well. And I was just mesmerized. I grew up in this little Presbyterian village in the south of Scotland, and then there are people who think like I do, and they have existed. And when you're 8 or 9, my concept of time and distance was a bit flexible. So the fact that this was a while ago and B across the other side of the world didn't really register. And then I found Rosemary Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth, which again, it was another wow, this is possible. And 2,000 years ago, sorry, but it didn't feel like that. It opened doors to realities that I had not been exposed to at all. So yeah, I think we pick the path and we dance it as well as we possibly can. And we can ask. There are all questions about free will and what do we choose, and I have no idea the answers to those, and I don't really care because, as long as you do what you're doing as well as you can do it, and it feels like the thing you need to be doing just now, then I don't know about that, and I don't think it matters.
Yeah, no, I think that's very fair. And kind of on this in these bits and pieces, Last of the Mohican, kind of offering this language that hadn't been gifted to you before. You mentioned you grew up in a Presbyterian village. One thing that I find very interesting about my path and relationship, and something that I see in other like-minded individuals' path in this way, is there tends to be a pretty radical deconstruction process and reconstruction process.
Yes.
And I grew up in Texas, and so the language that I was gifted was Southern Baptist Christianity. And I was Bible thumping until I was 9, 10, and realized, oh, this is just a language that I was given to talk about these things. And I feel so drawn to it because I feel this other thing. But what else is that? Why are there so many different ways that we can approach this conversation? So I just find that so fascinating. And then also in terms of language, you mentioned the difference between noun-centric and verb-centric. And I spoke with Jake Eagle, who is an author and a LPC meditation teacher. And a lot of his research centers around teaching people verb-centric language.
Really?
Wow. And it was one of the most rewardingly challenging conversations I've ever had in attempting to speak verb-centeredly throughout like an hour and a half.
So that would be interesting.
It was very, very cool. But I think also in kind of a mirror to that, I really love the accessibility of what you're saying in what can we do? We are all gifted these different, you have no control over the cards you're dealt. You get to decide how you play them, right? Any number of idioms over it. And to make sure we talk about the beautiful book that is Any Human Power as well, one of the beautiful things about it that raised a bunch of questions, but also offered some very interesting answers is the practicality of what can we do tomorrow? And I find that that is my frustration with leaving conversations like this, with trying to do this work, is what can we do tomorrow? So I just mentioned several things, but anything that's coming up for you, I'd love to hear. But also, I think most pointedly, I'm curious about your draw to this practicality of listening to this voice that is slowly becoming a shout, actually quite rapidly now becoming a shout.
It's pretty much a shout, isn't it? Yes.
Right. And as we mentioned before we hit record, the horrific weather events that are happening, very great example of how loudly things are shouting. Talk to me about this practicality and next steps in our lifetime, in our next waking hours.
Yes, exactly. Because when I was your age, we literally thought this was going to be a problem for our grandkids, but if we could do good stuff now, then we could help avert stuff. And now it's happening now. We've crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. The only reason we haven't crossed the 7th is that the oceans are a buffer, and when they go, they're going to go very fast. And then the only 2 that we haven't crossed are aerosols and ozone, and that's because people took action when it was obvious that they were an issue. So we're in a lot of trouble. But so there's a spiritual route into this, and there's a kind of neurophysiological, psychological route in, and they definitely merge. So I can't ever tell anyone what's theirs to do. Nobody can tell anybody else what's theirs to do. There is a beautiful interchange place, that kind of Venn diagram intersect, where our heart's greatest joy meets the world's greatest need.